Winlow had always been a quiet village, the kind of place where nothing much happened and everyone knew each other's business. But there was one part of the village that was never spoken of openly: Raven Hollow. A dense mist always seemed to linger there, as though the land itself rejected the sun. At the edge of that hollow sat the house, blackened and crumbling like a forgotten tomb. It had stood abandoned for nearly a century, though no one could recall why it had been left to rot. The villagers whispered of curses and strange happenings, but no one had ever dared venture near it. Until tonight, Lily, Mark, Sarah, Josh, and Ellie had huddled on a bench in the village square, their breath misting in the crisp October air. The Halloween festival was in full swing behind them. Kids in costumes, the smell of candied apples, laughter carried on the wind. But the group had their attention elsewhere. Raven Hollow loomed in the distance, barely visible through the veil of fog. Its very presence made their skin crawl. "We should go," Josh said, his voice low but excited. "Just to prove it's all a bunch of lost stories. There's nothing in that house but old wood and dust." Sarah looked skeptical, biting her lip nervously. "I don't know, Josh. Everyone says that place is cursed." Ellie shuddered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "My grandmother told me people used to hear voices coming from the hollow at night, and that people disappeared near the house. It's not worth it." But Josh, always the bravest, or perhaps the most foolish, leaned in, a challenging smile on his face. "Come on, Ellie. You're not afraid of some dumb ghost story, are you?" Mark, ever the practical one, shrugged. "I'm with Josh. Let's settle it once and for all. Besides, it's Halloween. What better night to check it out?" Lily, usually cautious, felt a strange tug of curiosity. She had heard the stories since she was a child, tales of a family that once lived in the house, of strange lights seen in the windows at night. Part of her wanted to know if there was any truth to it. She found herself nodding. "Okay, but we're not staying long." As they made their way to the edge of the village, the festive sounds of Halloween faded behind them. The path leading to Raven Hollow was overgrown, the trees twisted and gnarled, their branches like skeletal arms reaching out to ensnare anyone who came too close. The air grew colder the closer they got, an unnatural chill that sank into their bones. When the house finally came into view, they stopped in their tracks. It was worse than they had imagined. The building was old, its roof sagging under the weight of years, windows broken and dark. The front door hung slightly ajar, as if waiting for someone to push it open. Lily swallowed hard, her heart beating faster. "Are we sure about this?" Josh grinned, stepping forward. Too late to back out now. The others followed, their footsteps crunching over the dead leaves that littered the ground. As they crossed the threshold into the house, a gust of wind blew through the door, making it creak on its rusted hinges. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of damp wood. Cobwebs hung like veils in the corners, and the floorboards creaked ominously beneath their feet. The house was silent, but not the peaceful kind of silence. It was heavy, oppressive, as if the very walls were listening to them. Mark glanced around, his voice echoing in the empty space. "Well, here we are. Nothing to be afraid of, right?" But Lily wasn't so sure. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end, and despite the warmth of her jacket, a cold shiver ran down her spine. They hadn't seen anything yet, but already the house felt wrong. The house swallowed them whole, its dim interior offering only narrow paths between broken furniture and dust-covered relics of a life long forgotten. The group's flashlights flickered weakly, casting long, shifting shadows along the crumbling walls. Every step they took seemed to echo louder than the last, as if the house itself was amplifying their presence. Lily led the way cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. The cold air inside the house was unlike anything she had felt before, almost alive, wrapping around her like invisible fingers. The old wallpaper peeled from the walls in long strips, revealing strange stains beneath, darkened with age and something else. She didn't want to look too closely. "This place is a wreck," Mark muttered, nudging a toppled chair with his foot. His voice was tense, the bravado from outside already beginning to wear thin. The deeper they ventured, the more unsettling the house became. The sound of wind outside was replaced by an eerie stillness, the kind that made every creak and whisper stand out sharply against the quiet. It felt like walking through a place that had been abandoned not just by people, but by time itself. Josh tried to laugh it off, though his voice wavered slightly. See, told you, it's just a creepy old house, nothing to be scared of. But Ellie didn't seem convinced. Her eyes darted nervously from one darkened corner to another, as though expecting something to leap out at any moment. Doesn't anyone else think it's too quiet? I don't like this. Suddenly, a soft ticking sound broke the silence. Lily stopped dead in her tracks, holding up a hand to signal the others. Do you hear that? They all fell silent, straining to listen. The sound was unmistakable now, a rhythmic ticking, steady and slow, coming from the foyer they had just passed through. Sarah frowned, turning her head toward the source. It sounds like a clock? Josh scoffed, though his voice wasn't as confident as before. So what? Maybe an old clock is still working. It's not exactly terrifying, but as they made their way back toward the foyer, they realized something was wrong. The sound grew louder, each tick reverberating through the air, unnaturally loud for such a small room. The old grandfather clock stood tall against the wall, covered in dust and cobwebs, but it was indeed ticking. The pendulum swung back and forth slowly, each movement deliberate and measured. Yet, when they looked closer, they noticed something impossible. The hands of the clock were frozen, stuck at exactly midnight. Lily's stomach churned as she stepped closer to it. How is it ticking if it's not moving? Josh's grin faltered. It's probably just broken. Let's keep going. But as they turned to leave, a loud bang echoed from above, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps creaking down the stairs. Ellie gasped, grabbing Mark's arm. Who's up there? They all turned toward the staircase at the end of the room, their flashlights casting trembling beams of light into the darkness. The footsteps continued, slow and purposeful, as if someone or something was coming down to greet them. No one's up there, Josh whispered, though he sounded far from convinced now. It's just the house settling. But the footsteps didn't stop. Step by step, they grew louder, each creak of the wooden stairs sending a jolt of fear through the group. It felt as though whatever was coming down was drawing closer with an intent that sent a chill through their bones. Mark swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. We should go. As the final step creaked, they saw it. A shadow, long and distorted, stretching across the far wall of the foyer. It loomed impossibly large, like the silhouette of something standing at the bottom of the stairs. But when they aimed their flashlights toward the stairs, they saw nothing. No one was there. The shadow, however, moved. It twisted, curling along the wall as though it were alive, independent of any source, and it was moving toward them. Panic set in. Sarah's breath quickened, her grip tightening on her flashlight. We need to leave, now. But before they could act, the temperature in the room plummeted, the air growing so cold that their breath misted in front of them. The shadows around them seemed to stretch, flickering like dying flames, and the sound of whispering filled the air. Faint at first, barely audible, but rising steadily, an urgent, desperate sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. Lily strained to make out the words, her heart racing. The whispers swirled around them like a cold wind, just out of reach, and then she heard it clearly. Leave, before it's too late. Her blood ran cold. The others heard it too. Ellie's face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. Did you hear that? The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices, pleading, warning. The house itself seemed to breathe with the sound, the very walls alive with the ominous energy surrounding them. Josh, now pale and visibly shaken, backed toward the door. Okay, this isn't funny anymore. The group huddled together, their fear palpable. Something was horribly wrong with this house, and whatever was inside it didn't want them here. The shadows continued to writhe, closing in slowly, and the whispers grew more frantic, more insistent. Lily's voice was barely a whisper now. We need to get out of here. But as they turned to leave, the front door, still slightly ajar from when they entered, slammed shut with a force that shook the entire house. The slam of the door reverberated through the house like a death knell, cutting through the group's panicked breaths. Mark rushed to the door, yanking at the handle with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge. It's stuck. It won't open. His voice was high-pitched, frantic now. Josh joined him, slamming his shoulder against the old wood, but the door refused to give way, as though something much stronger was holding it shut from the other side. "What the hell is going on?" Josh muttered, fear creeping into his voice. Lily stepped back, her eyes wide as she scanned the room, watching the shadows shift unnaturally along the walls. "It's the house. It doesn't want us to leave." The words felt wrong even as she said them, but deep down she knew they were true. Something in Raven Hollow had awoken, something that had been waiting for a long time. Ellie, trembling, pointed toward the stairs. "Look." The shadow from before had returned, twisting along the far wall like ink spreading through water. It was no longer just a shapeless figure, it was gaining form. Long, gaunt limbs stretched from it, and a distorted head began to take shape, though its features were obscured by the darkness. It didn't follow the natural contours of light. There was no source for the shadow. It simply existed, defying logic, moving with a sickening slowness toward them. "Run!" Sarah's voice broke the spell of frozen terror, and they all scrambled back into the depths of the house, deeper into the unknown halls. They found themselves in a narrow hallway, the walls closing in around them like a tomb. The further they went, the colder it became, until the very air felt like ice against their skin. Their flashlights flickered erratically now, the bulbs struggling against the oppressive darkness. Suddenly the house groaned. It wasn't just the old wood settling, it was a deep, echoing sound, as if the very foundation of the house was shifting. And then the whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping voices like a chorus of the damned. The words were jumbled, urgent, but one message stood out clearly in Lily's mind. "The mirror shows the truth." Her pulse quickened. "The mirror? We need to find a mirror," she stammered, barely able to explain her thought process through the rising panic. "What are you talking about?" Mark asked, but Lily was already moving, drawn by an instinct she couldn't explain. They stumbled into another room, the doorway barely visible in the encroaching darkness. It was a small study, filled with dust-covered books and cracked leather chairs. But at the far end, standing crooked against the wall, was a large, ornate mirror. The frame was covered in strange, swirling designs, almost like symbols, and the glass was murky, its surface rippling faintly like water. "This is it," Lily whispered, though her voice trembled. The mirror felt wrong, its presence in the room too deliberate, as though it had been waiting for them. Ellie shook her head, backing away. No, I don't like this. We need to get out of here, Lily." But before anyone could stop him, Josh stepped forward, eyes fixed on the mirror. "It's just a stupid mirror," he said, though there was no conviction left in his voice. He reached out, touching the surface. The effect was immediate. The room plunged into total darkness for a split second, a suffocating void that swallowed the light from their flashlights entirely. Then the light flickered back on, but something had changed. The mirror no longer reflected their pale, frightened faces. Instead, the surface shimmered, showing something else entirely, something far more sinister. In the reflection, they saw themselves standing in the room, but they were not alone. Behind each of them stood a figure, pale, gaunt, their faces twisted into expressions of unspeakable torment. Their eyes were hollow black pits, and their hands rested on the shoulders of each teenager, as though claiming them. Lily's breath hitched in her throat as she recognized the figures. They were the family, the cursed family from the old stories. Their clothes were tattered, their skin gray and decayed, but there was no mistaking them. The whispers intensified, a cacophony of tortured voices pleading for release. Suddenly, the reflection of Josh moved independently, his face twisted into a grotesque grin, far removed from his actual expression of shock. The reflection stepped closer to the glass, placing his hand on the other side, his voice distorted and echoing from the mirror. "You're not trapped in here with me. I'm trapped out there. With you." The reflection's grin widened, and then, without warning, the mirror shattered. Glass flew in every direction, but none of it cut them. Instead, the shards clattered to the ground, revealing something hidden behind the glass. An old leather-bound journal. Ellie screamed, stumbling back, her voice barely audible over the sound of the house groaning again, as if it were alive, shifting around them. "We have to leave now." Lily grabbed the journal, her hands shaking as she opened it. The pages were yellowed with age, filled with scrawled handwriting, but the words that stood out chilled her to the core. They cannot leave. Bound by the curse, we suffer in the shadows, waiting for the living to join us. Beware those who enter Raven Hollow, for the house demands a sacrifice. Only blood will set us free. The room suddenly felt claustrophobic, the air thick with a malevolent energy that pressed in on them. They were trapped, just like the family, bound to the house, and now the shadows were closing in, more real than ever. Lily looked up at the others, her voice trembling. This isn't just a house, it's a prison, and we've opened the door for something that should have stayed locked away. The journal felt heavier in Lily's hands than it should, like it was weighed down by the sheer horror of the words it contained. The others stared at her, eyes wide with terror as they realized the gravity of their situation. Josh's voice was barely a whisper, hoarse with fear. What does it mean? Blood? A sacrifice? Lily swallowed hard, her throat dry. The house, it's cursed. That family, those figures we saw in the mirror, they're trapped here. But not just trapped. It's like the house is feeding on them, keeping them bound. And now, it wants us. Ellie's face drained of all color, her breathing fast and shallow. No, this isn't real. This can't be real. Mark sits up dead closer to the shattered mirror, his eyes scanning the broken shards that littered the floor. The reflection they had seen still haunted him, those gaunt figures standing behind them, their cold, dead hands resting on their shoulders. The mirror showed us them. But why us? Why now? Lily flipped through more pages of the journal, her fingers trembling. The writing was erratic, desperate, as though the person who had penned it had been slowly unraveling. There were notes about the house's history, the dark rituals performed within its walls, and the family that had once lived here. But one passage stood out. The mirror binds us to the truth. It reflects not what is, but what will be. Those who gaze into it are marked. The house will consume them unless they can find the key to break the curse. But beware, the key comes with a price. The mirror, it marks whoever looks into it, Lilith whispered. It shows the future, the moment when the house will claim us. Josh's eyes darted nervously to the fragments of the mirror. So what do we do? Is there a way to stop it? Lily turned another page, the paper fragile beneath her fingers. There was something about a key, but the journal wasn't clear. Then she found it, an entry written in shaky, almost illegible handwriting. Only the blood of the living can satisfy the house's hunger, but it must be freely given. Without a willing sacrifice, the house will take its fill by force. Lily's heart sank. The house wasn't just feeding on their fear. It wanted blood. And if they didn't offer it willingly, it would come for them anyway, one by one. The whispers in the walls seemed to grow louder, as though they knew the group was close to understanding the horrible truth. Sarah, who had been quiet until now, spoke in a voice barely audible over the eerie sounds around them. So, someone has to die? That's the only way out. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. No one dared speak, the silence thick with dread. The wind outside picked up, rattling the broken windows, and the house groaned again, as though responding to Sarah's question. It felt alive, aware of them in a way that made their skin crawl. Ellie backed away, shaking her head frantically. No way. We're not doing that. There has to be another way. Lily clenched the journal tightly, her knuckles white. It says the blood has to be given willingly. If it isn't, the house will kill us all. We can't fight it. You've seen the shadows, the things in the mirror. They're already closing in on us. It's only a matter of time. Josh slammed his fist against the wall, his frustration boiling over. This is insane. I'm not dying in this place. We're not sacrificing anyone. The room grew colder, the temperature plummeting so quickly that their breath formed in clouds before them. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched toward them, creeping along the floor like living things. The house was no longer content to wait. Its hunger was palpable now, pressing down on them like a weight in the air. Suddenly, the door to the study slammed shut behind them with a force that rattled the walls. The lights flickered wildly, and the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside. Heavy, dragging footsteps, growing closer and closer. The whispers rose again, louder now, more desperate, filling their ears with fragmented pleas. Give it to us, or it will take you. Lily's chest tightened as the full weight of the situation hit her. The house was a predator, and they were the prey. It had already marked them with the mirror, and now it was circling, waiting for its moment to strike. The journal had mentioned a key, but there was no sign of anything resembling a key in the study. Lily's mind raced, trying to piece together the cryptic clues. Could the key be metaphorical? Was the sacrifice itself the key to breaking the curse? Josh's voice cut through the chaos, trembling with fear. "Lily, what do we do? We can't just give up." Lily looked around the room, her thoughts spinning. Then, as if by some unseen force, her eyes landed on the mirror fragments again. In one of the larger pieces, she caught her reflection, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. But behind her, in the reflection, was something else. A figure, hunched and twisted, its eyes gleaming with malevolent intent. Without thinking, Lily grabbed a shard of the broken mirror, her fingers wrapping around its sharp edges. The mirror, it's tied to the house somehow. If it can show us the truth, maybe it can give us a way out. Ellie's voice shook with panic. "What are you talking about?" Lily held the shard up, staring into it. Her reflection twisted and distorted, but something else became clear. A shadowy figure stood behind her, waiting, and in its outstretched hand was an object, barely visible in the dark reflection. A key covered in blood. Lily's heart pounded. The key wasn't something they could just find, it was something they had to make. "Blood," she whispered. "It's always been about blood." Mark frowned. "What do you mean?" Lily looked at him, her eyes hollow with dread. "We have to give the house what it wants. Blood, but not a sacrifice. We can't let it take one of us. We have to give it willingly." Josh shook his head, stepping back. "No way. I'm not cutting myself open for this place." But Lily didn't wait for an argument. Without hesitation, she pressed the sharp edge of the mirror shard against her palm and drew it across her skin. Pain shot through her hand, but she didn't stop. Blood welled up from the cut, dripping onto the floor. The effect was immediate. The house seemed to shudder, the walls groaning and the shadows recoiling slightly, as though the blood had momentarily sated its hunger. The whispers grew quieter, more distant. Lily looked at the others, her voice shaky but resolute. "If we all give a little, maybe we can escape. We can't let the house take us." The tension in the air was suffocating, the house groaning like a hungry beast, impatient and relentless. Lily stood, her hands still bleeding from the self-inflicted wound, watching as her blood dripped onto the dusty floorboards. For a brief moment, the house had recoiled, its shadows pulling back like a predator that had been momentarily distracted. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Mark stepped forward hesitantly, glancing between the blood on the floor and the broken mirror shards. "You really think this will work? Just bleed and we're free?" Lily's face was pale, her breathing shallow from both fear and the pain in her hand. "I don't know, but the journal said blood was the key, and the house reacted when I..." She trailed off, unsure of her own logic, but knowing they had no other option. The others stared at her, their faces reflecting the same horrifying realization. There was no escape without playing the house's twisted game. Josh clenched his fists, his face a mask of defiance. "I don't like this. I don't trust this house." Ellie shook her head, still trembling. "But what if we don't do it? The shadows, those things, they'll come for us, won't they?" Lily nodded slowly, her eyes dark with dread. "It's already started. If we don't do something now, it'll just take us, one by one." The house seemed to respond to her words, the walls creaking loudly as if to emphasize the danger. The air grew colder again, the shadows stretching once more from the corners of the room. The whispers had returned, more urgent now, pleading for blood, for release. Josh swore under his breath, but grabbed a piece of glass from the broken mirror, his expression hard. "Fine, I'll do it. But this better work, or I swear." Without finishing, he slashed his hand, the sharp edge biting into his skin. Blood welled up immediately, and he let it drip onto the floor beside Lily's. The moment his blood joined hers, the house groaned again, louder this time. The shadows around them flickered, retreating even further into the darkness. Ellie was next. She was crying softly, shaking uncontrollably as she grabbed a jagged piece of glass and cut her palm. "I don't want to die here," she whispered, the blood spilling from her hand onto the floor. "I don't want to end up like them." Mark hesitated, watching as the others bled onto the floor. His hands shook as he picked up his own shard of glass. "What if it's not enough?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "What if the house wants more than this?" Lily, feeling the weight of that question, shook her head. "We don't know, but we have to try." He closed his eyes tightly and made the cut, grimacing as the blood pooled in his palm before falling to join the others. The room seemed to shift again, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly, as if the house was considering the offering. For a moment, there was a tense silence, the air charged with anticipation. And then the whispers stopped. The shadows, once crawling toward them, slithered back into the cracks and corners of the room. The walls stopped groaning and the cold air began to warm, if only slightly. For a fleeting second, it seemed as though it had worked. They had given what the house wanted, and now they could leave. But just as they began to relax, a loud, echoing crack reverberated through the house. The sound was deep, like the earth itself splitting apart, and it came from beneath their feet. They all froze, their eyes wide with fear. The floorboards began to splinter, the wood groaning as if something massive and unseen was pressing up from below. The blood they had spilled seeped into the cracks, disappearing into the depths of the house, and with it went their hope of escape. "No, no, no!" Josh shouted, backing away as the floor beneath him started to break apart. The crack widened, forming a jagged, black fissure that snaked across the room, splitting the house in two. From the darkness below came a deep, guttural sound, a growl, low and menacing, like something ancient had been awakened. Low and menacing, like something... Ellie screamed as the ground began to give way beneath her. She grabbed onto Mark, her fingers digging into his arm as they both stumbled back. "What's happening?" she cried, her voice raw with terror. Lily's heart raced as she watched the fissure grow wider, the house shuddering violently around them. "We gave it the blood. We gave it what it wanted," she yelled. But there was no answer from the house, only the deep, guttural rumble from below. Suddenly, from the darkness of the fissure, pale, decayed hands began to emerge. Dozens of them, reaching, clawing at the air. The same hands they had seen in the mirror, belonging to the cursed souls trapped within the house for so long. "They're coming!" Ellie screamed, pulling back as one of the hands grabbed at her ankle, its bony fingers digging into her skin. "They're going to drag us down!" Josh kicked at one of the hands, his voice frantic. "We need to get out. There has to be another way." But the house was alive now, more than ever. The walls pulsed, the shadows growing denser, swirling around them like vultures circling dying prey. The ground beneath them was crumbling, giving way to the abyss that lay just beneath the surface. Lily looked around, desperate for some kind of answer. But the journal had said it clearly. The house demands a sacrifice. They had given their blood, but it hadn't been enough. It would never be enough. The house wanted a soul. "I'll do it," she said suddenly, her voice steady despite the panic in her heart. The others turned to her in shock. "What? No," Mark protested, stepping toward her. "We can't just let the house..." Lily shook her head, her mind made up. "It's the only way. The journal said a willing sacrifice. If one of us gives ourselves to the house, the rest might be able to leave." Josh grabbed her arm. "We're not letting you do this, Lily." But Lily pulled away, her eyes filled with determination. "If we don't, we all die. The house will take us all, one by one. If I do this, maybe you can escape." The growling from below grew louder, the hands reaching higher, clawing at the air. The house was waiting for its sacrifice. With one final look at her friends, Lily stepped toward the fissure, her heart pounding in her chest. The house seemed to respond to her decision, the ground beneath her feet stabilizing as though it had accepted her offer. "Lily, no!" Ellie cried, tears streaming down her face. But Lily didn't stop. She stood at the edge of the abyss, staring down into the darkness where the hands reached up toward her. "Get out of here," she whispered to her friends, her voice shaking. "Run. Don't look back." And with that, she stepped forward into the waiting hands of the house. The house groaned one final time, a deep, satisfied sound, and then the fissure began to close. The ground solidified beneath them, the shadows pulling back, retreating into the walls. The oppressive air lifted, replaced by an eerie stillness. Josh, Mark, Ellie, and Sarah stood frozen, watching in stunned silence as the house sealed itself, as though nothing had happened. But Lily was gone. The front door creaked open, a cold wind blowing through the room. They had survived, but the cost had been unimaginable. And as they stumbled out of the house, Battered and broken, they knew one thing for sure. The house was never truly abandoned. It had always been waiting for the next willing soul. The house's hunger had been satisfied for now, but they would never forget that moment when the house made its terrible demand. They had escaped Raven Hollow, but deep down they knew there's always a price to be paid. The town of Coldwater had always taken Halloween seriously, but this year there was an extra buzz in the air, as if everyone was trying to outdo themselves in festive spirit. The main street was decked out with grinning jack-o'-lanterns, their hollow eyes flickering ominously in the growing twilight. Fake cobwebs hung from every porch, and skeletal hands reached out of perfectly manicured lawns. Children dressed as ghouls, witches, and monsters ran laughing through the streets, their footsteps echoing in the cool autumn air. To anyone watching from the outside, it was a picture-perfect small town celebrating a night of innocent fun. But Detective Ethan Ross could feel something was wrong. A weight pressed on him as he walked through the town square, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd of smiling faces. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there was a sense of something lurking just beneath the surface, like the town was holding a secret it wasn't ready to share. Over the last few days, minor incidents had trickled into his department, things that, on their own, seemed harmless enough. Pets had gone missing. People swore they saw shadows moving in the woods, shadows that didn't belong to anyone. There had even been reports of strange symbols carved into trees at the edge of town, but when the sheriff's office sent someone to investigate, they found nothing. It wasn't enough to spark real alarming. After all, it was Halloween, and the residents were eager to embrace anything spooky. It was probably the collective imagination of the town running wild. But for Ethan, something about these incidents nagged at him, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a deep indigo, the town's carnival began. The sound of carnival music echoed through the streets, and the smell of fried dough and caramel apples filled the air. Ethan watched from the edge of the festival, his eyes drawn to the woods just beyond the town. The trees stood tall and dark, barely visible in the dim light. For as long as he could remember, Coldwater had been surrounded by that forest. It was the kind of place parents warned their children not to wander into, especially at night. Old superstitions, Ethan thought. But tonight, those trees looked different, alive somehow. Watching, waiting. A group of teenagers ran by, laughing and shouting as they tossed eggs at a house across the street. Halloween pranks were starting, and no one seemed to notice that the wind had picked up, or that the air had grown colder. Colder than it should be for an October night. Then the first scream pierced the evening. It came from just a few houses down, high-pitched and full of panic, the kind of scream that twists your stomach. Ethan's instincts kicked in, and he was already running toward the sound before he even realized it. A mother stood on the sidewalk, her face pale, hands shaking as she called out a name. "Oliver! Oliver!" She looked around wildly as if expecting her young son to appear any second, but the boy didn't. The mother explained that he had been standing right next to her one moment, pulling at her hand impatiently to go trick-or-treating, and the next moment, he was gone, vanished without a sound. Ethan searched the area, calling out the boy's name, his flashlight sweeping over lawns and between parked cars, but there was no sign of Oliver. The boy had simply disappeared, as if he'd been plucked from the earth. And the odd thing was, no one saw him go. A group of children, no more than a few feet away, said they hadn't seen anything strange at all. As Ethan interviewed the bystanders, that oppressive feeling of dread settled deep in his bones. Something was wrong, very wrong. The night was only just beginning, but the sense of normalcy in Coldwater had already started to unravel. The boy's disappearance was the first crack in the facade, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't be the last. Somewhere beyond the flickering carnival lights and carved pumpkins, something was stirring, something that had been waiting for this night for a long, long time. As the dark swallowed the last remnants of daylight, the town's festive glow now seemed like a thin veil, barely holding back the shadows creeping in from the woods. Coldwater, for all its Halloween charm, was on the verge of a nightmare. Ethan could feel it. The question was, how many more would vanish before the night was over? The joyful atmosphere of Coldwater had shifted drastically since the disappearance of young Oliver. In the days that followed, an unsettling silence blanketed the town. Parents grew more watchful, children clung tighter to their families, and the once vibrant Halloween decorations felt like eerie reminders of a day that had turned into something sinister. Ethan, burdened with the weight of the missing boy's fate, threw himself into the investigation, determined to find answers. Each day, the townspeople whispered rumors, their anxiety escalating as more residents reported inexplicable occurrences. Pets continued to vanish. Furry companions that had once been playful and affectionate were suddenly gone without a trace. Even the local sheriff was beginning to feel the strain. The panic was palpable, and the authorities seemed at a loss. In the midst of all this, Ethan remained focused on the missing boy, yet he sensed the larger shadows looming over Coldwater. One rainy evening, while poring over his notes, Ethan's phone buzzed with a call from the sheriff's office. A middle-aged woman, Kathy, had gone missing from the town square during the festival. She had been one of the committee members organizing the carnival. Her absence sent shockwaves through Coldwater, a town already fraying at the seams. It felt like a dark hand was reaching into their lives, pulling away their loved ones. Ethan knew he had to visit Kathy's last known whereabouts, hoping to find some clues. As he walked through the remnants of the festival, abandoned booths and scattered decorations littered the park. The remnants of what had once been a joyful gathering now served as haunting echoes of happiness lost. It was then that he caught sight of an elderly man sitting alone on a bench, his eyes fixated on the ground. His name was Frank, a longtime resident of Coldwater, known for sharing stories of the town's peculiar history. Ethan approached him, his curiosity piqued. "Hey, Frank," Ethan greeted, trying to draw the man's attention. "Did you see Kathy last night?" Frank looked up, his face lined with worry. "You shouldn't be here, son. Not tonight. You don't understand what's going on." He glanced nervously around as if the shadows themselves were listening. "This town, it's built on something dark, something that wakes up on nights like these." Ethan felt a chill crawl up his spine. "What do you mean?" he pressed, his interest ignited. "There are stories, legends," Frank murmured, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Every few decades, when the night is right, it awakens. The hunger rises from the ground. It takes what it wants." "What are you talking about?" Ethan asked, his skepticism fighting against the creeping fear in his gut. "Children disappear, families torn apart. They don't just vanish, son. They're consumed. The town was built to keep it at bay, but it's getting stronger. The woods are alive tonight." Ethan's mind raced as he processed Frank's words. Was it possible that the strange occurrences were tied to some ancient force? The idea felt ridiculous, but the disappearances were real. What if there was a deeper truth behind the chaos? Determined to find answers, Ethan spent the next day retracing Kathy's steps, interviewing anyone who had seen her last. As he delved deeper into his investigation, he began to experience unsettling visions himself. Flickers of movement at the edges of his sight, a shadow darting behind a tree, the sound of whispering voices carried by the wind. One night, while driving past the edge of the woods, he swore he saw something standing among the trees. A silhouette, tall and twisted, seemed to watch him with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The deeper he dug, the more his dreams were plagued by nightmares. Visions of twisted faces and hollow eyes, cries for help echoing in the darkness. He began to question his own sanity, grappling with the feeling that something was reaching into his mind, seeking to drive him mad. Despite his fears, Ethan sought out Frank again, hoping to uncover more about the town's dark history. The old man spoke of rituals, sacrifices made to keep the entity beneath the earth subdued, tales of families who had vanished in the night, whole generations erased from memory. It was a history that had been buried beneath the town's festive charm, but it was very real. "This is the night," Frank warned, his voice trembling. "It will feed again. We have to stop it." With the clock ticking down to midnight, Ethan felt the weight of urgency settle in his chest. He knew he had to confront whatever was haunting Coldwater. Armed with the knowledge of the legends, he ventured to the edge of the woods, determined to uncover the truth. The shadows beckoned him, promising answers, but they also whispered of danger. As he stood at the threshold of the forest, he felt an unsettling sensation wash over him, an overwhelming sense of being watched, as though the very trees were alive and aware of his presence. Ethan took a deep breath and stepped into the darkness, knowing he was approaching the heart of the mystery and the source of the evil that threatened to consume Coldwater. As Ethan stepped into the woods, the world of Coldwater faded behind him. The air grew colder, wrapping around him like a shroud, muffling the distant sounds of the town. Shadows danced between the trees, twisting and writhing in the fading light. The gnarled branches overhead seemed to stretch toward him, eager to pull him deeper into their embrace. With every step, the atmosphere thickened, charged with an electric anticipation that sent chills racing down his spine. The path wound tighter as Ethan ventured further, the ground soft and spongy beneath his feet, swallowing his footsteps like a hungry mouth. As he moved, the shadows shifted, coiling and unfurling as if alive. The woods were a maze of darkness, and every instinct screamed at him to turn back. But he pressed on, fueled by the desperate need for answers, for the truth behind the disappearing townsfolk and the dark legends that haunted Coldwater. The deeper he traveled, the more he felt the presence of the ancient entity Frank had described. It was there, lurking just beyond the edges of his vision, a formless weight that pressed down on him, whispering promises of terror and doom. Ethan's flashlight flickered as he entered a small clearing, and for a moment, the world stood still. The air was thick with silence, pregnant with expectation. Suddenly, he was overwhelmed by a vision, vivid and horrifying. He saw the town, but it was twisted, warped by the entity's hunger. Buildings crumbled into the earth, the laughter of children turning into screams, the shadows swallowing whole families. Ethan staggered back, his heart racing, but he couldn't look away. In that moment, he understood. The town was a prison, and the entity was the warden. It had been waiting for this night, preparing to reclaim its due. As he shook off the vision, he felt a cold breath on his neck, a whisper that was almost human, yet devoid of warmth. "Join us," it hissed, echoing through the trees. Panic surged through him, and he turned to run, but the shadows shifted, blocking his path. With desperation clawing at his insides, Ethan pushed forward, racing toward the heart of the forest, where he sensed the entity's power was strongest. The trees closed in around him, their branches snagging at his clothes, pulling him back. But he refused to yield. He had to reach the center, to confront whatever was awakening there. In the depths of the woods, he found it, a clearing bathed in an unnatural glow. The ground was covered in strange symbols, etched into the earth like a forbidden language. In the center stood a stone altar, ancient and ominous, blackened by age and stained with something dark and thick that glimmered like oil. It was a place of power, a site of sacrifices long forgotten. As he approached, the shadows writhed around him, forming shapes that flickered in and out of existence. Ethan's breath quickened as he realized the truth of the stories he had heard. This was where the town had kept the entity at bay, where families had offered tributes to ensure their safety. He could feel it now, a malevolent force pulsing beneath the earth, hungry and restless. The wind howled through the trees, and the ground trembled as if the very fabric of reality was fraying. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, a twisted silhouette that seemed to blend into the darkness. It moved with a fluid grace, a presence both terrifying and compelling. Ethan felt his heart pound as the entity spoke, its voice a dissonant chorus of whispers, weaving through his mind like a thread of ice. "You came seeking the truth, detective. You seek to understand the hunger that binds this town." Ethan's mind raced. "What do you want from us? Why are you taking our people?" The figure laughed, a sound that echoed with malice. "They are not taken. They are offered, a necessary sacrifice to keep the balance. You will learn this truth, as all who seek to defy me must." Ethan felt an overwhelming compulsion to submit, as if the very shadows were wrapping around his will, urging him to join them, to give in to despair. He fought against it, recalling the faces of those who had vanished. Oliver, Kathy, all the families that had been ripped apart. Anger surged within him, fueling his defiance. "No," Ethan shouted, clenching his fists. "I won't let you take anyone else." In that moment of resistance, the ground beneath him shuddered violently, and the entity's voice grew darker, more threatening. "You think you can stop me? You are but a mere mortal, a fleeting whisper in the vastness of my hunger. Coldwater belongs to me, and soon, you will too." The shadows converged, swirling into a vortex of darkness, and Ethan knew he had to act. In a desperate bid, he reached into his pocket, pulling out the small, rusted amulet his grandmother had given him as a child, a talisman that had always been dismissed as superstition. As he held it up, the shadows recoiled, their form faltering against the light that emanated from the amulet. "What is this?" the entity hissed, its voice dripping with venom. "You cannot wield light here. You belong to the dark." But Ethan pressed forward, fueled by a newfound resolve. "I am not afraid of you, Bag," he shouted, channeling all his fear and anger into that small token. The amulet glowed brighter, illuminating the clearing and forcing the shadows to retreat. The ground rumbled and the entity screamed, a sound that pierced the night, echoing with rage and confusion. As the light pushed back the darkness, Ethan felt the power of the ancient entity begin to unravel, its hold over the woods weakening. But the victory was short-lived. The shadows writhed violently, and Ethan realized he was in a race against time. The entity was not going down without a fight, and the final confrontation was imminent. Determined to end this once and for all, Ethan stepped closer to the altar, knowing he had to confront the core of the entity's power. He needed to sever the link between the town and the ancient force that had kept it shackled for so long. But as he approached, the shadows surged around him, and the night grew thick with a palpable sense of dread. The true test was about to begin. As Ethan approached the ancient altar, the shadows coiled around him like serpents, trying to drag him back into the abyss. With the amulet clutched tightly in his hand, he felt a flicker of hope fighting against the overwhelming darkness. Yet, the very air seemed to thrum with the entity's rage, a malevolent energy that threatened to swallow him whole. The altar pulsed with an eerie rhythm, a heartbeat that echoed through the clearing, resonating deep within Ethan's chest. He knew that whatever dark pact had been forged to keep the town safe was bound to this ancient structure. It had fed on fear, pain, and sacrifice for centuries. This night marked the crescendo of its hunger, a night when it sought to reclaim what had been taken from it. "You think your light can conquer the darkness?" the entity hissed, its form shifting violently as it loomed above the altar, a formless mass of shadow and dread. "This town is mine. I am the night. I am the hunger." Ethan felt a surge of panic as the shadows writhed, forming faces that twisted in agony, some familiar, some unknown. He saw the ghostly images of those who had vanished, their eyes wide with terror, mouths open in silent screams. The very essence of their souls seemed to plead for release, urging him to save them from the entity's clutches. "You took them!" Ethan shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "You've taken too many. I won't let you take anyone else." He felt the amulet's warmth growing stronger in his grasp, illuminating the darkness around him. Gathering every ounce of courage, Ethan raised the amulet high, channeling his fear and anger into it. The shadows recoiled, shrieking as the light pierced through the darkness, illuminating the faces that haunted him. In that moment, he understood the truth. The amulet was not just a talisman, it was a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, light could prevail. "You are nothing but a fleeting thought, a moment in time," the entity howled, its voice now a cacophony of rage and despair. "You cannot destroy me. I am eternal." But Ethan refused to falter. With a final surge of determination, he stepped onto the altar, feeling the pulsing energy beneath his feet. "This ends tonight," he declared, and with all his strength, he hurled the amulet toward the heart of the altar. As the amulet struck the ground, a blinding light erupted, cascading across the clearing. The shadows screamed, their forms twisting and writhing in agony as the light surged forth, ripping apart the very fabric of the darkness that had bound Coldwater for generations. The air crackled with energy, a shock wave that sent Ethan tumbling back. For a moment, the world stood still. The screams of the shadows morphed into a deafening roar, a sound that echoed through the woods and sent tremors through the earth. The darkness writhed and churned, collapsing inward upon itself as the light consumed it, revealing the truth beneath. A chasm that had long been buried, a void that had craved the life it had taken. In a final desperate attempt, the entity lashed out, a swirling mass of shadow that lunged for Ethan. But he stood his ground, heart racing, and the amulet's glow intensified, radiating outward like a beacon. The shadows recoiled in fear, and with one last ear-splitting scream, the entity was drawn into the light, its form fracturing and dissolving into nothingness. Ethan fell to his knees, panting as the light began to fade. He looked around, breathless, as the clearing transformed. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the air felt lighter, as if the very essence of the woods had been cleansed. The shadows that had once loomed ominously now retreated, banished into the night. As he rose, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. The faces of those who had vanished flickered in and out of his mind, but now they seemed less like shadows and more like memories, whispers of those who had been freed. He could feel their gratitude, a gentle embrace of warmth in the cold air. Ethan stumbled back toward the town, heart pounding with adrenaline and relief. The moon hung high in the sky, illuminating the path home, and for the first time that night, the world felt safe again. The familiar sounds of cold water reached his ears, the laughter of children echoing from nearby homes. But as he approached the town, a sense of foreboding crept back in. Had he truly defeated the entity, or merely delayed its hunger? The whispers of the past lingered, reminding him that darkness is never truly vanquished. It waits patiently, hidden just beyond the light, ready to rise again. As Ethan emerged from the woods, he felt the cool night air wrap around him like a familiar cloak. The moon hung high, casting a silvery glow over Coldwater, illuminating the streets that were now alive with laughter and chatter. It seemed the town had returned to normal, but deep down, Ethan sensed that something had irrevocably changed. The joyous sounds felt distant, like echoes of a past he could never return to. He walked through the town square, where families gathered, children darting from house to house, their laughter a stark contrast to the ominous events of the night. Yet, as Ethan took in the scene, he noticed a peculiar tension in the air. The townspeople smiled, but their eyes held a flicker of fear, a shadow of uncertainty that lingered just beneath the surface. In the days that followed, Ethan sought to understand the aftermath of the entity's defeat. While the immediate threat had been vanquished, the scars of its presence remained. News spread through Coldwater of the strange occurrences that had taken place. The stories of disappearances now part of the town's whispered history. Ethan felt compelled to share what he had learned, to warn the townsfolk that the darkness could return. He arranged a town meeting where residents gathered in the old community access center, their expressions a mix of hope, and apprehension. Standing before them, Ethan spoke passionately about the legends, the sacrifices made to keep the entity at bay, and the importance of unity in facing whatever darkness might come again. He urged them to remember the power of light, of community, and to remain vigilant. Yet as he spoke, Ethan noticed something unsettling, an undercurrent of discontent among the townspeople. A group of older residents exchanged glances, their faces hardening with skepticism. It was as if some in Coldwater had already resigned themselves to the darkness, whispering that it was an inevitable part of their history. That night, as he returned home, Ethan's unease deepened. The shadows around him felt thicker, the laughter of children a distant echo. He caught glimpses of movement at the edges of his vision, fleeting shapes that flickered like dying embers. Was it merely his imagination, or had the entity left remnants of itself behind, lingering like a bad dream? In the weeks that followed, Ethan continued to feel the weight of the town's history pressing down on him. He dedicated himself to understanding the legends more deeply, seeking out Frank for guidance. The elderly man revealed fragments of lore that spoke of cycles, how the entity fed on fear, how it thrived on the belief that it could return. Each time it was confronted, it adapted, growing stronger, finding new ways to reach into the hearts of those who dared to forget. Ethan's dreams grew darker, plagued by visions of shadows creeping toward the town, whispers echoing in the stillness of the night. He often found himself awake in a cold sweat, the images of twisted faces haunting his thoughts. With each passing day, he became more convinced that the entity was not truly gone, merely waiting for the moment of weakness to strike again. One fateful evening, as he patrolled the town, a bone-chilling fog rolled in from the woods, thickening the air with a sense of dread. Ethan's heart raced as he saw the shadows begin to stir once more, moving in the periphery of his vision. He could hear the whispers now, low and insistent, weaving through the fog. Join us. Become one with the darkness. Determined to confront the threat before it grew, Ethan rushed to gather the townspeople. But as he reached the town square, He found it empty, the laughter and light replaced by an unsettling silence. Panic surged through him. "Where is everyone?" he called out, but his voice echoed unanswered through the mist. Suddenly the shadows deepened, swirling around him, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The entity's voice emerged from the darkness, a twisted amalgamation of the townspeople's fears. "You think you can escape me? I am in their hearts, their minds. I am Coldwater." Ethan felt a cold grip of terror seize him, but he refused to succumb. He reached for the amulet, but it felt cold and lifeless in his hand. The shadows converged, their forms shifting and coalescing into the familiar faces of those who had been lost. Oliver, Kathy, the pets and families that had vanished into the night. They looked at him, their eyes pleading, but their faces twisted with an unnatural hunger. "Save us, Ethan," they whispered, their voices a chorus of despair. "Join us. Become part of the darkness." In that moment, Ethan understood. The battle was not over, it had only just begun. He had momentarily pushed back the darkness, but it had seeped into the hearts of the townspeople, infecting their spirits with fear. Coldwater had become a vessel for the entity, a town forever caught in a cycle of light and darkness. With renewed determination, Ethan raised the amulet one last time, drawing on every ounce of courage he possessed. "No, you will not take them again," he shouted. The shadows lunged for him, eager to pull him into their grasp. "You are not their master. You will not win." The amulet flared to life, illuminating the fog, but instead of retreating, the shadows surged forward, enveloping him in a whirlpool of darkness. Ethan fought against the tide, struggling to maintain his grip on the light, but the whispers grew louder, more chaotic. "You cannot resist. You will join us." As the darkness threatened to swallow him whole, Ethan felt a flicker of hope, a reminder of the faces he had seen in the clearing, the townspeople who had once laughed and lived without fear. He focused on that light, letting it fill him with strength, pushing back against the darkness that sought to consume him. With one final burst of energy, he released the light from the amulet, sending a shockwave through the shadows. The entity screamed, its voice a cacophony of rage and despair. But Ethan stood firm. The darkness writhed and twisted, and with a deafening roar it began to unravel, pulled apart by the light. The fog lifted, the shadows dissolved, and Ethan collapsed to his knees, breathless and shaken. Coldwater stood before him, the town bathed in moonlight, yet he could still feel the weight of the darkness lingering at the edges. Though the immediate threat had been banished, he knew it would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next Halloween night. Ethan looked out at the town, a mix of relief and sorrow flooding through him. He had saved Coldwater for now, but the struggle against darkness was far from over. He vowed to protect the town, to remind its people of the stories that bound them together. As he rose to his feet, he understood the true nature of the horror he had faced. It was not just an ancient entity, but the very fear that resided in the hearts of every person in Coldwater. And as long as that fear existed, the shadows would always return. The autumn air hung heavy in Millfield, its coolness contrasting sharply with the warm glow of street lamps lining the sleepy town. As leaves spiraled down from gnarled branches, whispers of an unsettling legend danced through the streets. Stories of a forsaken house at the end of Oakwood Lane known only as the Hollow. Nestled between twisted oaks and dense underbrush, the house loomed like a beast waiting in the shadows. Its once grand facade was now a patchwork of peeling paint and shattered windows, casting a long, eerie shadow that seemed to stretch beyond the boundaries of reality. Locals spoke of disappearances that spanned generations, each story soaked in fear and steeped in the kind of terror that left a lingering chill. Children dared each other to approach its threshold, but none ever crossed the line into the darkness that shrouded it. In the heart of this town were 5 inseparable friends: Jess, Mark, Lisa, Derek, and Amy. They were the kind of friends who shared secrets under the stars, laughter echoing late into the night. With the October moon waxing bright, the group made a pact. Tonight they would confront the house and unravel its mysteries. Fueled by curiosity and a thirst for adventure, they gathered at Jess's house, excitement shimmering in the air like static electricity. "Are you guys really going to do this?" Amy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. eyes wide with a mix of intrigue and fear. "Of course, it'll be fun," Jess replied, attempting to dismiss the unease creeping in around the edges of her own excitement. "We'll take some flashlights and explore. What's the worst that could happen?" Mark rolled his eyes, trying to appear brave. "It's just an old house. I mean, come on, ghosts aren't real." Lisa, usually the most skeptical of the group, felt a shiver crawl down her spine at the thought of the hollow. It's just that everyone who goes in comes back with stories. Bad ones." Derek chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. "That's just small-town gossip. Let's make our own story. What do you say?" The friends set off, a sense of trepidation weaving through their laughter as they approached the house. The closer they got, the more the atmosphere thickened, the air heavy with unshed secrets and ancient sorrow. Jess pushed open the rickety gate, which groaned in protest as if warning them to turn back. They hesitated for a moment, exchanging glances filled with both thrill and doubt, but curiosity won out. As they stepped onto the creaking porch, the wind whispered through the trees, a haunting melody that sent shivers racing down their spines. The door swung open with a loud creak, revealing a darkened foyer filled with shadows that seemed to flicker and dance as their flashlight beams flicked over the cracked walls. "Welcome to the Hollow," Jess whispered, her voice barely breaking the silence, a thrill running through her as they crossed the threshold into the unknown. Inside, the house was a labyrinth of musty rooms and forgotten memories. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, illuminated by their flickering flashlights. They began to explore, the thrill of discovery fueling their bravery. Laughter echoed off the walls, momentarily masking the palpable tension that crept closer with every passing moment. Each room told a story of a life once lived: an overturned chair, a dusty old mirror, faded photographs lining the mantelpiece, their eyes staring back as if warning the friends to leave. But the deeper they ventured, the more the atmosphere shifted. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, and whispers brushed against their ears, carrying snippets of conversations long past. It was Jess who first noticed something was off. A fleeting shadow darted across the corner of her vision, vanishing as she turned her flashlight in its direction. "Did you see that?" she asked, her heart racing. "See what?" Mark scoffed, trying to maintain his bravado but unable to shake the unease gnawing at him. "It's probably just the wind," Derek said, though he too felt a prickle of fear at the back of his neck. But as they moved from room to room, the house seemed to awaken, each creak of the floorboards resonating like a heartbeat, drawing them further into its dark embrace. The laughter faded, replaced by an unsettling tension that hung in the air like a thick fog. With every step, the house whispered its secrets, inviting them deeper, ensnaring their curiosity in a web of dread. In that moment, they were oblivious to the truth lurking just beyond their sight, a truth that had waited patiently, hungry for souls to wander too far into its grasp. They were mere players in a game far older than themselves, unaware that the house had already chosen its first victim. As darkness fell outside, a low, mournful wind blew through the cracks in the house, carrying with it an ancient promise. Tonight, the hunt would begin. As the group ventured further into the bowels of the hollow, their flashlights flickered, casting erratic beams across the decaying walls. The rooms became more claustrophobic, the air damp with mildew and something far older, something rotten. The once jovial mood of the group began to dissolve, replaced by an uneasy silence that only grew heavier as they descended deeper into the house. Every step felt wrong. The atmosphere shifted, more than just the cold of the night setting in. It was as if the house was changing around them, its walls tightening, watching. The house no longer seemed like a collection of crumbling rooms, but a living thing, a predator lying in wait. With every passing moment, the feeling of being hunted became more tangible, though none of them dared to voice it. It was Derek who first wandered off, drawn by a strange sound, a faint, delicate melody that floated through the stillness, beckoning him toward the kitchen. "Guys, listen," he called, his voice echoing unnaturally off the walls. They heard it too, faint but unmistakable. A music box? The tune was hauntingly familiar. Like a half-remembered lullaby. Jess and the others hesitated at the kitchen's entrance as Derek crossed into the darkened room alone. They waited. A beat passed, then another. But Derek never came back. "Derek!" Jess called, her voice trembling as she edged toward the threshold. The room was empty, no music, no Derek. Panic rippled through the group like a cold current. They rushed into the kitchen, their flashlight beams cutting through the thick gloom, but all they found was silence. Nothing of Derek remained. No footprints in the dust, no sign of struggle. It was as if he had been erased. The eerie silence in the kitchen weighed heavily on the remaining friends as Jess, Mark, Lisa, and Amy exchanged frantic glances. The reality of Derek's disappearance settled over them like a suffocating blanket, chilling their bones. "We need to find him," Jess urged, her heart racing. "He can't just be gone." But the fear that coursed through them felt different now, more potent, more primal. The house had shifted once more, each hallway and room morphing as if to confound their every attempt to escape. They moved as a tight-knit group, their laughter replaced by nervous whispers and furtive glances, feeling the walls of the hollow close in around them. Shadows lengthened, stretching like claws reaching out from the darkness, and with every step, the unease became more palpable. "I'll go check the basement," Mark suggested, trying to sound brave. The idea made Jess's stomach churn, but she nodded, knowing they had to find Derek. Lisa and Amy exchanged worried looks, but agreed to stick together, each of them knowing that separation meant vulnerability. As Mark descended the creaky wooden stairs, the air thickened around him, heavy with an oppressive silence. The basement was a cavernous space filled with dust-laden furniture draped in white sheets, like the ghosts of the past trapped in limbo. His flashlight beam flickered ominously, casting grotesque shadows that danced along the walls. The remnants of the old house loomed large, echoing faint memories of laughter, sorrow, and loss. In the depths of the basement, Mark spotted something moving in the corner of his eye. He turned quickly, only to be met with darkness. Heart pounding, he took a cautious step forward, peering into the inky blackness. Suddenly, an unearthly sound broke the silence, a low, mournful wail that seemed to reverberate through the walls. It wasn't a sound he recognized. It was something raw and animalistic, echoing with a desperate longing. "Derek," he called, voice cracking as he fought to remain calm. But there was no reply, only the hollow echo of his own voice fading into nothingness. Meanwhile, upstairs, Jess, Lisa, and Amy explored the rooms frantically, calling for their lost friend. The house felt different now, as if it were alive, breathing with anticipation. Shadows skittered just out of sight, whispering secrets that taunted them. The wallpaper peeled away in places, revealing dark stains beneath, evidence of the lives that had come before. Wardom, tales of despair that resonated in the air like a dirge. As they entered the living room, a sudden chill swept through the air, snuffing out Jess's flashlight. The darkness enveloped them, thick and suffocating. "Turn it back on!" Lisa shouted, her voice shaking. The panic in her tone echoed their growing fear. Jess fumbled with the flashlight, her hands trembling as she clicked it back on. The beam illuminated a figure standing at the far end of the room, a fleeting silhouette just out of reach, before it disappeared through the doorway. "Did you see that?" Jess gasped, her heart racing. "I don't want to be here anymore." Amy whimpered, her face pale, glancing nervously around them. The laughter and bravado they had shared earlier felt like a distant memory, replaced by the dread that clawed at their hearts. Without another word, the trio decided to find Mark, their footsteps echoing through the darkened halls. They navigated the winding corridors. Each corner they turned felt like stepping deeper into the house's clutches. The air was thick with an unsettling silence, broken only by the distant creaks of the floorboards. As they approached the basement door, a guttural scream erupted from below, shattering the silence like glass. "Mark!" Jess cried out, panic flooding her voice. The scream faded into the depths, leaving a chilling echo that hung in the air. In a flurry of adrenaline, Jess pushed the door open, the old hinges screeching in protest. They rushed down the stairs, flashlights illuminating the oppressive darkness. But the basement was empty. Mark was gone. "Where is he?" Lisa whispered, trembling, fear creeping into her heart. Suddenly, from behind them, a deep, echoing laughter reverberated through the basement, thick with malice. The friends turned to find themselves surrounded by shifting shadows, figures that twisted and writhed just beyond the reach of their lights. Their forms were indistinct, yet their eyes glimmered with a predatory hunger. Watching, waiting. "Run!" Jess shouted, her instincts kicking in as she grabbed Lisa and Amy, leading them back up the stairs. They stumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath, but the house had changed again. The corridors twisted, disorienting them, and soon they found themselves face to face with the wall of shadows, dark figures closing in, whispering their fears into the void. Each whisper became a memory, dredging up moments of vulnerability, fears of failure, of rejection, of being alone. Jess's heart raced as she recognized the darkness that taunted her, the shadow of her own insecurities manifesting into something tangible. Just as hope began to slip through their fingers, a momentary flash of light illuminated the hallway. They turned to see Mark at the end, his expression a mix of horror and disbelief. But before Jess could call out to him, the shadows lunged forward, and he vanished into the darkness once more. "No, not you too!" Jess screamed, but the words echoed into the abyss, swallowed by the darkness. Now it was just the three of them, standing in the heart of the house, engulfed by shadows. A single thought raced through Jess's mind. The house wasn't just a place. It was a predator, and they were its prey. And as they huddled together, the walls began to close in, and the hunt truly began. Desperation clawed at Jess, Lisa, and Amy as they staggered back through the twisting hallways of the hollow, the shadows swirling around them like a storm of malevolence. The oppressive darkness was not just a physical presence, but something deeply sinister, feeding off their fears and despair. Each step felt heavier, each breath more labored, as if the house itself was siphoning their strength, drawing them deeper into its clutches. "Where do we go?" Lisa cried, her voice strained with panic, her eyes darting around, desperately searching for an escape. The flickering beams of their flashlights cast ghastly silhouettes that loomed over them, warping into nightmarish forms that danced and twisted with malicious intent. Jess's heart raced as she recalled the journal they had found earlier. "We need to go back to the living room. The journal. It had information about the house and how to confront it." But the house twisted their sense of direction, the hallways elongating and shifting, leading them in circles as they frantically searched for a way out. As they pushed through the oppressive darkness, shadows seemed to whisper their deepest fears, coaxing memories of failure and rejection to the surface. Jess felt the weight of her insecurities pressing down on her. "You're not brave enough," a voice hissed in her ear, echoing her own doubts. "No, I won't let you in," she shouted, shaking her head as if to clear her thoughts. They reached the living room, gasping for breath, the weight of their fears pressing down on them like a physical force. Inside the room, the air crackled with tension. Jess hurriedly flipped through the pages of the dusty journal, her hands trembling as she searched for anything that could help them escape. Lisa and Amy stood close, their eyes scanning the room, every shadow feeling like a predator ready to pounce. "The house feeds on fear. We need to confront our fears to weaken it," Jess read aloud, her voice shaky but resolute. "We must acknowledge them, face them head on." "I can't," Amy began, her voice trembling. "What if it shows me something I can't handle?" "You can do this, Amy. We can do this together," Jess urged, her own resolve starting to strengthen in the face of the darkness. "We can't let it win. We have to fight back." As they stood in the dim light, Jess felt the shadows pressing closer, their whispers rising to a fever pitch. They could see the outlines of the figures forming in the corners of the room, grotesque faces twisted with malice, eyes glinting like shards of broken glass. The shadows were alive and they hungered for fear. Okay, Lisa said, her voice rising in strength. "Let's do it. We'll face our fears together." Suddenly the shadows lunged forward, their forms coalescing into a monstrous figure that towered over them, a grotesque amalgamation of their darkest thoughts. It loomed in the center of the room, a swirling mass of darkness with eyes that glowed with an otherworldly light. Jess felt her heart race as the figure spoke, its voice echoing like a death knell. "You cannot escape. You are nothing without your fears. Let me show you what you truly are." In that moment, the shadows surged forward, wrapping around them, and they were pulled into a nightmarish vision. Jess found herself standing alone in a vast, dark void, surrounded by echoes of her past failures. A distorted reflection of herself emerged, clad in the weight of her insecurities. "You think you're brave?" The reflection sneered, its voice a chilling mimicry of her own. "You're just a coward hiding behind your friends." Jess felt her heart sink, the truth of the reflection piercing through her defenses. She fought against the rising despair, summoning every ounce of strength. "No, I'm not a coward. I've faced my fears before," she shouted, grounding herself in her memories of courage, of standing up for others, of moments where she had been brave. As she faced her reflection, she saw its edges begin to flicker and dissolve, and with it, the oppressive darkness began to weaken. The figure wavered and just shouted, "I am stronger than my fears." Meanwhile, Lisa and Amy were battling their own demons. Lisa stood frozen in the void, paralyzed by the echoes of a past filled with self-doubt, a voice whispering, "You'll never be good enough." But she steeled herself, recalling the moments where she had triumphed despite her insecurities. "I am good enough," she yelled, and with that affirmation, she felt the grip of darkness begin to loosen. In another corner of the void, Amy faced her fear of isolation, haunted by the voices of those who had betrayed her trust. The shadows twisted around her, taunting her with memories of abandonment. "You will always be alone," they hissed. But Amy, fueled by Jess and Lisa's strength, shouted, "I am not alone. I have friends who care for me." With that declaration, the darkness shuddered, and the figure of shadows began to crack, fragments of its form dissipating into the air as the three friends confronted their deepest fears. They could feel the weight of the house beginning to lift, the shadows retreating as the power of their resolve weakened the darkness's hold. As the figure melted away, Jess felt a surge of energy coursing through her. "Together," she cried, reaching for Lisa and Amy, their hands linking in solidarity. The shadows, now agitated and shrieking in anger, lashed out one final time. But the trio stood strong, their combined strength creating a barrier of light that pushed back against the encroaching darkness. The house groaned as the power of their unity shattered the remaining shadows, sending them swirling away into nothingness. The last of the darkness dissipated with a final, anguished wail, and for a fleeting moment, the air grew still and quiet. Exhausted but resolute, the three friends stood in the now illuminated living room, panting heavily as they tried to process what had just transpired. They had faced their fears and in doing so, confronted the malevolence of the Hollow. But even as the oppressive atmosphere lifted, a lingering sense of dread clawed at Jess's mind. "Where's Mark?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. As if in response, the house trembled, the air thickening once more. A chill enveloped the room and shadows began to creep back, coalescing into a menacing form. Jess felt her heart drop as the last remnants of darkness surged forward, revealing the twisted visage of Mark, his eyes vacant, a hollow shell of the friend they once knew. "No!" Jess cried, but it was too late. The house had not finished with them yet. The air in the hollow thickened with a dreadful finality as Mark's shadowed form emerged from the darkness, his eyes glazed and devoid of recognition. The trio stood frozen, fear rooting them to the spot, hearts pounding in their chests. Jess felt a knot of horror tightening in her stomach. This wasn't the Mark they knew. It was as if he were a puppet, strings pulled by a sinister force that had taken residence within the house. "Mark, can you hear me?" Jess called it out, her voice trembling. But the figure merely tilted its head, a grotesque smile stretching across its face, twisted and wrong. It took a step forward, the sound echoing hollowly in the dim light. "Help me!" The voice was a faint echo of Mark's, layered with a deeper, darker tone that sent chills down their spines. It felt like a cruel mockery, a taunt from the very house that had consumed him. "Mark!" Lisa shouted, stepping forward, her fear giving way to desperation. "We're here! Fight it!" The shadow lunged, its form shifting into a swirling mass of darkness, tendrils reaching for them But Jess, recalling the power of their earlier confrontation, grabbed Lisa and Amy's hands. "No, we're not afraid of you!" The darkness halted, flickering uncertainly, as if the light of their resolve was pushing against it. But even as they stood united, Jess could feel the weight of dread settle over them again, a chilling realization creeping in. This house had consumed more than just their friends. It was a predator, a creature of despair that thrived on fear, feeding on the souls of those who dared to enter. "Mark!" Jess cried again, her heart aching at the sight of her friend trapped within the darkness. "You have to fight it. Remember who you are. Remember us." In response, Mark's shadowed form writhed, a battle evident in the flickering shadows. "I can't," he gasped, His voice strained as he struggled against the oppressive force surrounding him. Suddenly, a vision flashed through Jess's mind. Derek's laughter, the way they'd all shared secrets and dreams. She felt the warmth of those memories ignite a spark of hope within her. "We're all together. You're not alone, Mark," she shouted, her voice echoing with strength. The shadows hesitated, and Jess seized the moment. "We're stronger together. Fight it. We believe in you." The tendrils of darkness hesitated, flickering uncertainly, and then recoiled as if wounded. Jess squeezed her friend's hands tighter. "Now let's confront this darkness once and for all." The three friends stood firm, channeling their collective strength into a singular thought: unity against despair. They closed their eyes, focusing on the bond they shared, on the love that had brought them together in the first place. In a blinding flash of light, the room erupted into a cascade of brilliance, momentarily overwhelming the darkness. When Jess opened her eyes, the shadows had begun to unravel, twisting away from Mark's figure as he gasped for breath, breaking free from the darkness that had ensnared him. "No, you cannot take them!" A chorus of anguished voices erupted from the shadows, swirling violently around them. The remnants of darkness writhed and screamed, desperate to reclaim its prey. With one last surge of determination, Jess and her friends held onto each other tighter, their voices rising in unison. "We are not afraid. We will not be your victims." The combined energy of their declarations surged forward, crashing into the shadows like a tidal wave. The darkness shrieked, its form twisting and contorting as it fought against the onslaught. It was a battle of wills, the love and determination of the friends against the insidious grasp of despair. With a final, anguished roar, the darkness shattered, exploding in a blinding flash of light that engulfed the room. Jess shielded her eyes, and when the light receded, she found herself standing in the now empty living room. The weight of the hollow lifted. The air felt fresh and clear, free of the oppressive presence that had haunted them. In the center of the room lay Mark, breathing heavily, his face pale but alive. "Jess," he whispered, blinking against the sudden light. "What happened?" Relief flooded through Jess, and she rushed to him, pulling him into a fierce embrace. "You're back. We thought we lost you." Tears of joy streamed down her cheeks as she hugged him tightly, the warmth of their friendship overpowering the fear that had gripped them moments before. Amy and Lisa joined them, a tight-knit circle of reassurance, and together they held onto each other, grateful to be alive, grateful to have conquered the darkness. As they looked around the room, they noticed the walls of the hollow were no longer crumbling. The air felt lighter, the malevolence dissipated. The house had relinquished its hold on them, the shadows retreating into the corners as if they were nothing more than a distant memory. But as they began to leave, Jess turned back, a lingering sense of curiosity gnawing at her. "What was it? What did we face?" Mark shook his head, his expression a mix of confusion and relief. "It was a part of the house. It fed on us. Our fears. But we stood together. We fought back." Jess nodded, understanding washing over her. "It's over. We broke its hold, but we need to tell others, warn them about this place." As they stepped out of the hollow, the sunlight bathed them in warmth, the world outside filled with life once more. The darkness that had threatened to consume them was now a fading memory, but the bond they forged in that harrowing experience remained unbreakable. Yet deep in the shadows of the hollow, a low, rumbling laughter echoed, a reminder that darkness is never truly vanquished. It waits, patiently, for the next unsuspecting soul to wander too close.